Hi, my name is Kevin and I collect old irons. In this video we're going to talk about the standing irons. Particularly we'll be talking about the goffers. These are the irons of old Europe, and let's paint the picture. As seen in any of the artworks of Rembrandt and his peers, the rich loved these very fancy ruffled collars. This painting is from the 1500s, and this is from the 1600s. You might note the millstone collar on the right. The styles of these collars and the clothing in general changed very rapidly. You can probably date an old painting to within a decade or two simply by the details of the clothing. Only the very rich could afford these, not just the collar itself and the associated trimmings, but also the staff that it would take to keep these in repair and ready for your next trip in the public. These fashions required considerable time and expense, which was the point. In old Europe, you showed what layer in the strata of society to which you belonged by what you wore, and this could not be faked. You could either afford this clothing or you could not. The successive layers of higher society were each separated by considerable additional expense. What members of high society did was strut around and ogle one another, and render judgment based on how well the other was dressed. What you could afford to wear meant everything. This highly stylized clothing required highly stylized equipment and expertise to maintain at considerable expense. The devices used to iron these collars and associated clothing from the 1500s to 1700s largely did not survive. What has survived is often very fancy and is now very expensive. My collection is focused on the American irons, and I do not spend a lot of time on the European and particularly the early European equipment. But these things do turn up occasionally, and we all should have some education on these to be able to recognize them. And they're so pretty, like this one here, that at the right price they're hard to turn down. And I do have some stories to tell. With time, the ruffled fashions went from collars to hats and to dresses. By the 1800s, Empire and Victorian times in England, these irons became more common. There were still very fancy irons for the hoi polloi, to be sure, but there was also a developing middle class that used less extravagant versions that are now widely collected and fall within the price range that the relatively modest collectors such as myself can purchase. All this fancy fashion seems rather alien to us Americans, particularly in this point in time, because we are the ones that got away from all this. Of course, there were higher levels of society in American 1800s as well, and these illustrations come from American magazines, but Americans by and large went to the fluters, and the goffers saw rather modest use in the United States. The seamstresses that worked on these ruffles used standing irons that allowed them to use both hands. This particular one is probably mid-1800s, probably from England. It's all brass, it's a beautiful piece, and it contains or includes a plug here. The plug was used to close this off to prevent dust and cobwebs from coming into this thing when it was not in use. When you were using it, you would use a slug, which might be heated in the fire, and then put it into here to heat this so that you could do your fancy work. Most of these goffers have a single barrel, but I happen to have here two goffers that have double barrels. This one is from France, I think, judging by the very fancy base, and this one has two original plugs. The one here is more likely British, I think, by its somewhat simpler lines, and it has two slugs. Whether these slugs are original or not, some uncertainty. Most typically, you see these things without either slugs or plugs. You'll see just the standing unit itself, but as I have a fairly modest collection of rather small size, I have focused on finding specimens that have the original plugs or slugs, just so I can show how these things are used. Here's a nice single barrel unit. It has lion's paw feet and some other fanciness about all this that is very consistent with the Victorian furniture, nice kitty, that we have here as well. I interpret this as being Victorian, British, mid-late 1800s perhaps. These do occur in brass as well. Let's pay a little bit of attention to the slug handle here though. Very robustly made, and the nature of the twist here is very fine, very even, with a nice little embellishment at the end. Very characteristic of the old wrought pieces, and you do develop an eye for this kind of work. And this fits in here pretty well. It's not an exact fit. Whether these two pieces have been together for all their lives, I don't know, but they certainly are of about the same period. Not all standing irons are goffers. This is called a mushroom iron. There is no heating device in this one, although some of these did have a lid into which you could put a slug. This one was probably used cold, perhaps with a external heated device in one hand while you're using the other hand to manipulate the ribbons for hats and so forth. We have seen some of the handheld devices similar to this in the millinery iron video. This particular one is made of iron but has finely made brass feet. I will remind you of a standing egg iron that we saw also in the millinery video. This is a large egg iron, which I bought at the recent Dave Irons auction and paid $300 for. This is well elevated, so this might have been under or within the hat. Whether this was heated or not, I'm not sure, and this may well have been used both ways. The base is fairly light, so not designed to retain heat for a while. All of the standing irons that I've shown thus far in this video are from the 1800s and are of the sort of lower middle portion of the range for these in terms of prices. The irons we've seen thus far have values of the circa $200 to maybe $300. The double goffer that I showed from France, I paid $425 for at the recent auction. There are a lot of fancier goffers at higher prices, and some of these have come up in recent online auctions, and we'll see at least pictures of those in a later video. But there also was a lower end. This lady, from a trade card illustration, does not strike me as being filthy rich, but a nice collar will turn some heads. The ribboned hats and ruffled dresses were becoming more popular by the middle 1800s, and by then the English foundries were starting to churn these out, so they were much less expensive and much more available to us. So let's take a look at a couple of the smaller goffers. This particular one has a pretty fancy base, and it has a brass barrel. It has what I think is probably an original slug, and I should tell you that I found this one on eBay for about $60. Good deal. And this one here is the first goffer that I ever picked up for my collection. And let me tell you a little bit about the story. About 30 years ago, we had just arrived here in New England. We had gone down to Vermont, visiting antique shops, as is our habit, and this was sitting in plain view in a table in the middle of the room, and I walked right past it because my eyes weren't conditioned to seeing these things. Kate pointed it out to me after the fact, and I said, "Wow, that's a goffer!" And I bought it for $35. Good price. Now, this is an English goffer from that late 1800s, being mass-produced by the foundries in England. It has very simple concentric lines on the base. I do want to point out to you that it has a chip in it. The chip, not a big deal for me then, and even today I'm happy to have this, but those of us who know the antiques such as the antique glassware, know that the chips can diminish the value. But irons like this generally can be found in the $35 without the slug, and with the slug in the $60 to $100 realm. This is also a fairly small goffer with a square base and a narrow barrel. These are called piping irons and were for very fine ruffles. This one is marked, the only standing iron that I have in this entire video that has markings. This comes from the Kenrick and Son foundry and is probably from West Bromwich in the middle of England. Kenrick mass-produced cast iron products and probably exported some of these to the US and Canada. And since these were mass-produced rather than handmade, these are fairly inexpensive. Let's look at the slug handle. This is beautifully wrought. The twisting here is very consistent and there is some nice embellishment at the end. With some experience, one can develop an eye for this. The slug on this particular goffer fits very nicely into the pipe. This is an original pair, and with a beautiful piece here with the fine wrought detail. I bought this at the recent auction for $275, which is a lot of money, particularly for an iron that is made of iron with simple markings and a Kendrick of all things, Kendrick being the salt of the earth in the goffering realm. But this is complete. It's just a beautiful piece, and I thought it was well worth the money. Let me show a couple of goffering irons that I have found in my travels here in New England. This one here I found about 20 years ago in a shop in southern Maine in a display case labeled as a colonial hot toddy mixer. It was $175 at the time, which was a lot of money for me in those days, but I bought it and I've always been very happy I did so. I think this is an American goffering iron. It might actually be of colonial age. It has a very simple design. The slug is, I think, original to the goffer itself. It's of the right length and diameter, but this is a little more rugged. The handle is a little more rugged, a little simpler than the British irons. Again, I think this is American, and I'm very happy to have it. And let me show you a second iron that I found in a shop in Vermont. This is a wrought iron clamp-on device. There are a fair number of these. This, by the way, looks like it might be a piping iron as well. There are a fair number of these that come from Denmark, and it might be that this is of that origin, but again, I wonder, having found this in Vermont, if this might be one of the creations of some American blacksmith of the colonial or early 1800s. I found this one for $70. And these show you the kinds of things that you can find if you keep your eye out. And finally, for my piece de la resistance, we all live for finding something truly rare and exotic for a good price, and this is one of my best stories. I found this in looking through the pictures for an auction in southern Maine. It was much more tarnished at that time, and the picture, I got to tell you, was quite fuzzy. But I looked at that and I said, that's a goffer, and that is something really nice. And so we drove down there. This was almost at the very end of a very, very long auction, but here it was. The auctioneer was an auctioneer of 20, 30 some odd years of experience and didn't even know what it was. He commented on this and said, does anybody know what this is? And there was some discussion, and somebody in the audience said, that's a goffering iron. And my heart sinks a little bit because I think, oh my gosh, I'm going to have a competitor for this, and this is going to go for more money than I can afford, I'm sure. But the auction started, $100? $100? Do I have $100? I'm just sitting on my hands, so to speak. And the auctioneer lowers the price to $50. $50? $50? $25, says the auctioneer. And I very gingerly lift up my paddle, and he says, $25? $25? Do I have $25? Sold for $25. $25. Just so you know, in the condition that this was originally in, it was probably worth $1,000. When I saw this, it was missing the piece here. There was either the barrel as I have it here or the finial. Uncertain exactly what that shape would be. It's not unusual that these things are missing pieces, and I sent this down to my good friend Richard Gillis, and he did his magic. He actually created this piece with the finial and inserted there. It's got a little bit different coloration so people understand that it's not original to the rest of this. He also polished this up, and again, that happens a lot with these very beautiful pieces. They have not been preserved in that condition with that sheen throughout their history. So a wonderfully beautiful piece. I'm thinking Italian, maybe 1700s, possibly earlier than that. So a very neat, exotic, valuable piece. This is my one truly extraordinary goffer in my collection. In the next video, we'll see some pictures of some of the other highfalutin goffers, and just so we know what that higher end can look like. So with all that, thank you again for watching these videos, and I appreciate your comments and suggestions. We'll see some more goffers and some other categories upcoming.